So I got a question from a viewer on another video in the Heaven's Gate 101 series. And this question reads, as you have talked to some of the members, which one do you find to be the closest to the original doctrine of Heaven's Gate? Or the opposite, who is the most detached from the original classroom teachings? I guess the first thing I would say is that we have sort of a ship of Theseus problem here when we're talking about the quote-unquote original doctrine of Heaven's Gate. On several levels, actually, now that I think about it. Well, a couple of levels. One of the defining characteristics of the history of the Heaven's Gate belief system is, I think, change. This isn't really up for debate. Heaven's Gate changed their teachings in some pretty significant ways. There are other ways where they retains a lot of the foundational beliefs that the rest of their worldview was based on. But in at least a couple of respects, they did make some alterations over time that were pretty substantial. And probably the most important of those is their position on suicide. Okay, we know this. We know that Heaven's Gate changed their position on suicide. This isn't something that anyone can deny, despite what the group themselves might have said. We know that in the early 70s, when the group was founded, Applewhite and Nettles explicitly told their followers not only that you were not allowed to bring an end to your own life, but that, in fact, none of them would die at all, that their bodies would be taken up to heaven intact. You wouldn't have to die, you wouldn't have to lay down your body or anything like that. A spaceship was going to come and it was going to take all the believers up to heaven. That's what they were taught in the beginning. So, by extension, bringing an end to one's own life was absolutely prohibited. Very obviously, something changed along the way, and there's debates amongst scholars about when exactly that change occurred and why it occurred, but the fact that it did occur is really beyond dispute. The evidence for that being, that's what they did. In 1997, 39 of them brought an end to their lives, and then over the next few years, several more did the same. So clearly something changed. So whenever we're talking about the original doctrine of Heaven's Gate, what exactly are we talking about? The other thing too is that if you ask the people in Heaven's Gate, what exactly is this new religion that you're founding? Well, they would have told you that they're not founding a new religion at all. They're just carrying on the work of Jesus Christ. So Heaven's Gate would have presented their ideas as really a continuation of the Gospels. Now, whether or not you agree with that is not really germane to this discussion. The fact of the matter is that is how Heaven's Gate themselves understood their belief system. That is how they marketed it, for lack of a better term, or one of the ways they marketed it. But of course, that does raise the question of which version of Christ's teachings. And I've talked about this in at least one other video, that this is, it's kind of meaningless for someone to say, oh, we're carrying the true message of Christ's teachings or the essence of Christ's teachings. That doesn't mean anything. That is what every Christian denomination thinks, that they've got it right and everyone else either has it wrong, or they have some things right, but some things, not so right. It has no meaning at all to say that you have the true interpretation of Christ's teachings, because that's all there is just interpretation. There is no such thing as just reading the Gospels and just knowing the correct way to interpret them. There is a coextension between reading the Gospels and interpreting them. There's no such thing as just reading them. So everybody's interpreting it their own way, which is not to say that there aren't, more or less plausible interpretations. I happen to think that most of Heaven's Gate's readings of the Gospels are pretty implausible, but that's neither here nor there. Fact of the matter is, when we talk about the original doctrine of Heaven's Gate, you could just as well ask them, well, hey, Heaven's Gate, what is this original doctrine of Christ that you think you're embodying, you're following, and you're preaching? So that's what I meant by we have like a couple different ship of Theseus type of questions whenever we talk about the quote unquote original doctrine of Heaven's Gate. I wanted to open with that. I'm not going to follow that line of thought too much further. I just wanted to present that as, a way of saying that this is a little bit more complicated than we might think. With that said, we can presume that by the original doctrine, this user means whatever the group happened to believe by the end of their original tenure, which is to say, what did the original group that ended their lives believe right before they did that? And to that point, just in case people aren't familiar with what some of those beliefs were, again, talked about this in many different places, but I think we can kind of distill it down to at least a few. Number one would be that there is this place called the next level, i.e. heaven, i.e. the kingdom of God. They use these terms interchangeably. These two people, Applewhite and Nettles, or T and Doe, came from the next level, and they came here for a specific purpose. The world was about to end or be recycled, as the group themselves would call it, and their mission was to teach people how to avoid this impending calamity. How do you do that? You overcome your humanness, which is to say, you learn to transcend your human ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. You want to learn how to be more like a member of the next level, because the next level is populated by these highly advanced extraterrestrials who are spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, anatomically, evolutionarily beyond human, as the group would say. And the purpose of splitting off from mainstream society and going and hanging out with Heaven's Gate, for the rest of your earthly existence, was basically like a training camp, or a garden, like a little greenhouse, because they liked agricultural analogies a lot. So you think of it as like a place where like they're the seeds of next level ways of thinking and conducting themselves, that those seeds that were implanted in their minds or their souls, again, they use these terms interchangeably. There's a lot of that when it comes to Heaven's Gate. They wanted this little place where they could, where these seeds could grow, where they could be nurtured. And they called this little community a classroom. That's what the user was alluding to when they asked about the original classroom doctrine. That's the other thing too, is that it's not just the doctrine of Heaven's Gate, right? Because we also always want to think about Heaven's Gate was a lifestyle. Belonging to Heaven's Gate from 1975 to 1997, if you belonged to the group at any point during that period, you lived a certain kind of lifestyle, and you lived with other people. You lived with other people that were following that path. That's important to consider, because I think that is the most visible difference between Heaven's Gate belief today and Heaven's Gate belief in the past. The fact that Heaven's Gate believers don't live communally. They don't live in like one place. Some of them don't even live in the same country. And most of them rarely interface with one another physically. Presumably, some of them, especially the converts, may have never met another Heaven's Gate believer in person. But I think this user is more interested in the original members. I'm just going to assume that that's what they're interested in. And yes, I have spoken to quite a few of the people who once belonged to the original iteration of Heaven's Gate at one time or another. There's a couple that I haven't spoken to. Maybe someday I will. Doesn't look like that's going to happen in the near future. It's not something that I plan on pursuing in the near future. But anything's possible, I suppose. But in terms of, do I think that out of all the members of Heaven's Gate that I've spoken with, is there one that I think is like more closely following the original teachings, or one or more that are not following the teachings properly or something? I want to be extremely clear here. These are not like this is not like the object of my research. This is not the point of me researching Heaven's Gate, is not to adjudicate what is ultimately an internal dispute between Heaven's Gate members. These are not scholarly questions. These are questions that are really only germane, I think, really only germane for people that subscribe to this belief system. These are questions that are only relevant to them, which is not to say that they're the only ones asking them. Again, I don't want to make any assumptions about what is motivating this question, but again, unfortunately, I can't afford to be naive and say with any certainty that that there's not something possibly motivating this question. So I'm trying to be a little bit careful, but also I really want to be clear about this, just really for anybody watching this. This is not something I think about. I do not sit around thinking, which Heaven's Gate believer is like the true believer or something. This is not a category that I think about at all. It is unbelievably unimportant to me. I have no interest in whatever beefs they have with each other. I have no interest, I should say, in getting in the middle of them. And with that said, the topic of differences between what it means to be a Heaven's Gate believer today and what it meant to be a Heaven's Gate believer in the past is something that I am very interested in. And like I said, it's not just about the doctrine, it's also about the lifestyle, the fact that there isn't really a physical community of Heaven's Gate believers anymore. You just have them sort of scattered all over the place, and a bunch of them don't even get along with each other. So there's that. I kind of look at that absence of a physical community as being really inextricable from changes in doctrine, because maybe that's more in line with what this user is interested in learning about. Is are there any changes in like how people go about practicing Heaven's Gate belief today? And again, yes, of course. I think that all of them, in one way or another, and I'm not going to get specific, but all of the people that I'm aware of who currently espouse belief in Heaven's Gate, who were part of the original movement, I got to be honest, from my perspective, I think they're all kind of detached from the original teachings to one extent or another. It's just a matter of, which things, like which rules do we think are super important and which ones do we think, oh, that doesn't matter anymore. And this is not really their fault either. I also want to be clear about that. This is a natural consequence of the fact that these are people who belongs to a group where if you want to distill the doctrine down to one thing, it's pretty much this: whatever T and Do say. That's the doctrine of Heaven's Gate in a nutshell. It's much more complicated than that, but that's sort of the non-negotiable aspect of the teachings. Like if you can't get down with that, you're not a Heaven's Gate believer. You can't be. So because T and Do are deceased, because no one who believes in Heaven's Gate can run to T and Do and ask them, oh, what did you mean by this? What did you mean by that? What should I do here? What should I do there? Because you don't have that anymore, all they have is interpretation. All they have is interpreting the words that were written down, the words that were put down in video form or whatever. Of course, they would disagree with this because they would say, no, I talk to T and Do all the time. That's wonderful. That's what, I mean, this is not any different really from like Christians. Like Jesus isn't walking around on planet Earth. You only have his words in the Bible, and you have all these different thousands of different denominations that interpret his teachings differently. I don't really look at Heaven's Gate as being that unique in that regard. It's the same thing with Islam. I mean, the entire schism between the two major branches of Islam comes down to a disagreement over who the prophet is supposed to have passed the torch on to, proverbially speaking. In a way, I actually think that's very similar to Heaven's Gate, very very similar. But so they don't have any way to like they don't have any way to confirm or adjudicate between these contested interpretations of the doctrine. So if I had to sum it up in one sentence, I would say they're all on an equal playing field in terms of how close or far away from the original doctrine they are. I don't look at it as like there's one who really is the true believer and these other ones who aren't, or there's all these other ones who are true believers, but then there's some who aren't. I don't look at it like that. I really don't. But this is sort of an informal thing. This is sort of just off the cuff. I hope that you got something out of it. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please do so below. Till next time, thanks.